At this point in the course, you know how to take great pictures, and you know how to edit these pictures. So the final section is going to talk about what to do with your pictures, how you can share them with others in ways that give them the notoriety that they deserve. And learning how to export and compress your pictures is the first step in that process. You have to export your pictures in the right dimensions and at the right quality so that they look as good as possible. And that's what we'll be talking about here. I'll give you a screencast in Lightroom that quickly shows you how to export your pictures in these right formats and the right size. We'll also talk quickly about exporting your pictures from a mobile device. And for our purposes, we're mostly talking about exporting for the web. I assume you'll want to share your pictures on your blog or on social media. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at how to export your pictures for the web so that your viewers can get the most out of them. Exporting and file size are important issues because the last thing I would want is for you to shoot amazing pictures, to edit them perfectly, and then to export them in a low quality, grainy setting that doesn't really showcase their full potential. But on the other side of things, large pictures take up too much bandwidth and they take too long for people to download. So you have to find that perfect medium where the picture looks as good as possible, but it's not a huge file. And this is really important, especially if you're running a food blog, because then the files are on your own server on the website. And in that case, they're going to have to be downloaded by everyone who looks at them. So if you look at this pancake picture here on my website, if I didn't compress this image and it was like a megabyte in size, then everybody who visits my website is going to have to spend forever downloading this 1 megabyte sized picture, and that's going to put a serious strain on my web hosting account or my server, costing me more money in the long run if I have a lot of visitors. So especially if you have a blog, it's important to make sure your images are really well compressed, where you still retain the full quality, but they're not gigantic files. And there's two key ways of reducing your file size. The first is to simply make the image smaller. For example, a 500 pixel image has the area that's a quarter of the size of a 1,000 pixel image. So if you reduce the actual physical size of your image, the result will be a much smaller file size. The other thing you can do is reduce the image quality setting. When you're exporting your photos from any application, there will usually be a setting where you can make it lower quality or higher quality, and you can slide it somewhere in between. So here we're going to look at each of these settings in turn, how and why you would want to reduce the physical size or the dimensions of your image, and how to reduce the quality or the compression level of your image. Now it's important for you to export your picture in the right dimensions, and dimensions are basically the size of your image measured in pixels. So these two pictures over here on the right, one of them in full size, not in the slideshow, but the full size is 700 pixels for the one on the left and 1500 pixels for the one on the right. So you'll notice that with a little bit of geometry, the area of the picture on the right is 4 times the area of the picture on the left. Now the one on the left is a much smaller file size at 150 kilobytes versus 415. It's almost 3 times smaller. But if you blow the images up, the one on the right is going to be higher resolution. So larger images are higher resolution, they just contain more information in a larger area, but they take up more space. So you want your images to be as big as they need to be for whatever purpose you're using them for, but you don't want to make them any bigger or else they waste space. If you're exporting them for your own blog or for your own website, then you'll need to know how wide your website is, usually somewhere between 500 to 700 pixels wide, and then you want to export your pictures in that size. So they're big enough to be seen at full resolution, but not too big that users have to download too much information that they're not really getting value from. The second issue to take into consideration is the quality. If you're watching this video on high resolution, you'll notice that this image here is certainly not in high resolution. I exported this from Lightroom with a quality setting of 0. Now that resulted in a very low file size, but it also resulted in an image that looks terrible, and you would never want to export your pictures that look like this. You can see all the different artifacts in the background, and it's just very, very fuzzy and very low quality. So what you want to do, and this takes a little bit of balance and practice to get it right, is to export your image as low quality as possible without reducing the visible appearance. And I'll show you a few examples in a second of how this works. The right range is not an exact science. It's not as if you can say you should always export your pictures at 50% quality or 30% or 90%. It just depends. But let me show you an example. This is the same picture exported from Lightroom. All the settings were the same size, except I exported 3 different versions. The first one, I slided the quality down to 0, and it resulted in a file that was 64 kilobytes. Second one, I exported at a quality of 50, and the image was 90 kilobytes. But the third one, at full 100% quality, it was 225 kilobytes. Now, if you compare these images, if you're watching this in high resolution and full screen, you can see the one on the left is really, really bad. It's obviously 0 quality. But I actually imported all 3 of these pictures at the same time, and it just added them into the slideshow. I obviously knew which one was the 0 quality, but I actually couldn't tell the difference between the 50 quality and the 100 quality. So what I'm saying is there's really diminishing returns after you get to above like 50 quality. So the file size is 2.5 times bigger at 100, but there's almost no visible difference in the quality of the image. So in this case, it would be a big mistake to export at 100% to make people download such a large image when there's no real difference in what they're seeing between 50 and 100. That's why you want to find the perfect balance where your image is at a low enough quality that the file size is small, but that it's not too low that you're reducing the actual visible appearance of it. So somewhere between probably 40 and 70 is usually the range you're looking for in Lightroom. So let's do a quick screencast. I'll just show you how I export my images in Lightroom and how you can control the dimensions and the image quality through the export settings in Lightroom. So here we are in Lightroom, and we're getting ready to export this picture. We've finished editing it, it looks beautiful, and we're ready to share it around the internet. So we'll export it using those 2 principles we talked about of controlling the height and the width, or the dimensions of the image, as well as the image quality or the overall compression. So from within Lightroom, we select the picture that we want to export. So for this one, we'll export this picture. Then we go up to the File menu at the top and click Export. This brings up a new window on top of the other where we have all of our export settings. There's a bunch of different sliders here that we can adjust. The first is the location. I have this automatically set to export to my desktop to make it easy, so I just leave that the same and I never mess with it. We can also rename our files. So if we're exporting a bunch of them at once, we can rename them to Superfood Balls 1, Superfood Balls 2, and on and on and on automatically. There's a video tab which is not applicable for this. And the 2 things that I really focus on with every image are the file settings and the image sizing. These are the 2 things that we talked about. The first controls the quality of our image. So here's that slider. We can adjust it down to 0. And remember what the picture looks like when we adjust it to 0. It's not very good. But when we adjust it to 100, the image quality is too good, the file size is too large, and we're wasting space. So for me, the sweet spot is around 60. Also, it's important to export your images into JPEG format. You see there are other options here. We can export Photoshop files or the original RAW file, everything else. JPEGs are always the format you want to use for food photography. PNGs are also popular, but they're not as well suited to real-life pictures. With JPEGs, you get the highest quality image with the lowest file size, and that's the preferred format for food photographs and other real-life pictures. So always export your pictures in JPEG. Once we've got our quality and our image file type set, the next thing we'll look at is the sizing, and this is the dimensions we talked about. How wide do we want our pictures to be, and how tall do we want our pictures to be in terms of the pixels. We could adjust this to inches, but for the web, we want to keep that on pixels. So I always resize my pictures to 700 pixels wide. This means that no matter how tall they are, they're going to be adjusted to 700 pixels wide, and the height will be variable depending on just the aspect ratio of the picture. For me, 700 pixels is perfect for my blog and perfect for sharing. But for you, if, for example, you have a blog where the content area is 400 pixels, then you'd want to export to be 400 pixels wide so that you're not using images that are too large with too big of file sizes for what you need. So depending on your usage, you'll adjust this to whatever you need. You can experiment with different options to see what's right for you. There's a few other tabs down here: the output sharpening, which I don't use, metadata, which adds copyright information to the back end of the image. There's also a handy watermarking tool that adds a watermark on top of your pictures. I don't use this, but I know a lot of people who do. So you can see down here, there's a watermark on my picture saying whatever I would want it to say. I can make it somewhat opaque or fully visible. And this is a handy tool if you'd like to keep copyright information on your pictures so that other people can't necessarily take them or steal your pictures without your watermark being on the picture and you being able to say, hey, that's my picture. So that is a nice feature if you'd like to keep copyrights on your pictures. I usually leave that unchecked, however. So this is the basic export window. We can export our file. Up in the right, we see that the task has been completed, and now on my desktop, here is the picture. And if I hit right-click, get info, I can see that this picture is 139 kilobytes. It tells me that right here. So that's a fairly small picture, given that it's 700 pixels wide. Now going back into Lightroom, there's one other thing I'd like to show you, which is that if you hold down the Control or Command key, you can select multiple pictures, and then go up to Export within Lightroom. Go up to Export, and you can export all of the pictures at once using those same settings. Another handy tool is that once you set up your settings the way you want them, you can actually just go to Export with Previous, skip the entire menu, and it'll export them automatically. So that's a quick look at how easy it is to export your images within Lightroom to set up the right quality and the right dimensions for exactly what you need. One final consideration is if you're not using a computer to edit and export your pictures, how do you do this on a mobile device? The good news is that you can actually ignore the image dimensions and the quality. You can keep them at full quality and full size. The reason for this is because if you're sharing a picture on your phone, you're almost certainly going to be using a mobile app, whether it's the Instagram app or the Pinterest app or the Facebook app or whatever it might be. And those applications actually have built-in a compression software that they use on the back end. So they'll accept your full-size image, and then they will compress it in whatever ways they need to compress it to get it to work on their platform. They have the automatic technology that will do that for you. So on your phone, you can keep it pretty simple and just export the full-size pictures. But you do want to be very mindful of the crop ratio in terms of whether the image is a portrait or a landscape or whether it's a square. We talked about this in a previous video, how Pinterest gives more real estate to portrait pictures, how Instagram only accepts squares, and we'll mention this again in more detail in the next lesson. But it's important that when you're cropping your image to get the right aspect ratio, that you're mindful of which size you should be using for each social network. So that's an important part of exporting pictures on your mobile phone. But as far as the compression goes, you can use full quality because whatever service you're uploading it to will ultimately compress it for you. Your homework for this lesson is to put into practice the things we've talked about. I'd like you to practice exporting different sizes and resolutions. Using Lightroom, export one picture, as I showed you in this lesson, using several different quality settings. So try exporting it at 0, try exporting at 50, try exporting at 100, maybe add 70 and 30 in there as well, and get a full range of options. Then open those pictures, see what the quality difference is like, and also see how big or small the files are in comparison to each other. This will give you a good idea of what range you'll probably want to export your pictures in, where they retain the full quality, but the image size isn't too large.